2022 will have been the year of many uncertainties and cautious optimism in Africa. While the launch of Pan-African payment and settlement system this year was monumental, the pandemic and a recession have affected free trade. Inflation sparked by the conflict in Ukraine has hit economies and wiped out many people's savings. But it hasn't been all bad. The crisis in Ukraine has been a boon for energy producers in Africa as Europe scrambles to dump Russian energy. Here is a look back at 2022.
The start of 2022 marked 1 year since trading under the African Continental Free Trade Area started. The AfCFTA aims to create a single market for goods and services in order to deepen the economic integration of Africa. But pace has been hampered by the pandemic and a recession. In February, African and European leaders gathered in Brussels for a summit billed as a new dawn in bilateral cooperation. While there were buzzwords and promises to do better and different, old realities largely define how the two continents relate. With Europe still seemingly distracted by events in Ukraine, it remains to be seen if action will match ambition. Despite being far from the theater of war, African countries found themselves dealing with the economic fallout from the fighting in Ukraine as fuel and food prices rose remarkably. To help offset a food crisis, African leaders traveled to Russia to negotiate the release of grains. For energy-rich African countries, Europe has been rushing to secure gas supplies, a windfall of sorts.
Speaking of gas, Mozambique in November joined the exclusive club of gas exporters. Here is what President Nyusi had to say.
Today, Mozambique enters the annals of world history as one of the exporting countries of LNG, which, in addition to representing an alternative source of supply, largely contributes to energy security in the countries with the highest consumption. Even before the Ukraine war, African economies were struggling to recover from the pandemic. As the global economy literally stopped, countries found themselves unable to service debt. As the Federal Reserve tightened interest rates after the war in Ukraine, the cost of borrowing became higher. Now Zambia, Tunisia, Ethiopia, and Chad, among others, have run to their creditors or the IMF to ask for debt relief. In July, the Democratic Republic of Congo became the East African Community's newest and 7th member. Congo's entry expanded the East African market to 300 million people and the region's GDP to $250 billion.
The Congolese people do not only want to be satisfied with the benefits of inter-community trade, but they aspire first and foremost to maintain relations based on peace and security for all.
Addis Ababa in February began generating electricity from its Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam after more than a decade of construction. With the dam, Ethiopia hopes to bring light to more than 60% of its 120 million people. China this year waived tariffs for nearly 8,800 items originating from 18 African countries as Beijing seeks to ramp up bilateral trade with the continent. China seeks to import $300 billion worth of African goods by 2025. Dubbed Africa's COP, the climate summit in Sharm el-Sheikh delivered a mix of hope and disappointment. Other than the loss and damage fund, there were no fresh commitments by developed countries to pay or pressure on them to honor previous commitments.
I now declare the conference closed.
While the IMF's outlook for the continent in 2023 is less rosy, some African countries could do well thanks to their natural resources. Happy New Year!